Okay, we're on DAF Yud Ches Amud Aleph, and we had gotten through yesterday trying to explain the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, who had said that mashkin, that liquids that become tameh, have the ability to be matameh, both food and kelim midioraisa. And we had clarified yesterday that Rabbi Yehuda later retracted from that position, and it was unclear whether he was falling back to the position of Rabbi Yossi and Reb Shimon, who say that liquid can be metame foods midioraisa, but not kelim, or whether he was falling back to Reb Meir's position, who says that they're not metame at all midioraisa. That's where we got up to yesterday. Now, we're up to the words Reb Yossi v'Reb Shimon omrim, la'ochlin tamein l'kelim tahorim. It's about 15 lines from the top, maybe 20. So Rabbi Yossi and Reb Shimon both say, this is the second opinion of the Brisa, and they say that liquid has the ability to be metame food, but it does not have the ability to be metame kelim. Amar Rabba, and we're going to spend the day analyzing this shita. Amar Rabba bar Barchana, Amar Reish Lakish, Rabbi Yossi b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbo Amro. That Rabbi Yossi is going according to his Rabbi Akiva in making this teaching. The Darish Yitma, because Rabbi Yossi is going to be learning the word Yitma the way that Rabbi Akiva does, and applying that same word Yitma to another pasuk. Now, what do we mean? Ditnan, Bo Bayom Darish Rabbi Akiva. There's a Mishnah that says on that very day Rabbi Akiva taught as follows. Now, anytime you find the words Bo Bayom, usually what it means is the day that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah became the Rosh Yeshiva, as recorded in the famous story in Maseches Brachas, that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah took over for Rabbi Gamliel. They opened up the Beis Medrash, and there was a tremendous increase in interchange of Talmidei Chachamim and Talmud Torah on that day. And on that day, Rabbi Akiva taught as follows: V'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem v'goymer. Now, if you look at the pasuk, it says, any earthenware vessel, asher yipol mehem el tocho, that something will fall into it that is tameh, referring to a sheretz in that context. Kol asher b'socho yitma, that anything that later goes into that kli shall become tameh, ve'oso sishboru, and you shall break that utensil. So the pasuk is telling me two things. Number one, that the kli that a sheretz comes into is tameh, and also that the food that comes into the kli afterwards shall also become tameh. And Eino Omer Tameh Ela Yitma, Yitame Acherim. So Rabbi Akiva taught as follows, taught a very important principle, that if bread falls into that kli after the kli had already become tameh through a sheretz, then not only does that bread become tameh, but it also has the ability to make other things tameh. Now, what does that mean? First of all, how does he see it? He sees it from the word Yitma. The word Yitma, the Torah could have said tameh, that it is tameh. But the fact that it wrote it as Yitma teaches me that it itself is Tameh, but you could also transpose the vowels and read it as Yitameh. And the fact that it could be read as Yitameh means that not only does it become Tameh, but it has the power to be Metameh other things. Now let's think about it for a second. That piece of bread that falls into the Kli, what is its status of Tumah? What level of Tumah is it? Well, the sheretz is an avhatuma. It falls into the kli becomes a rishon latuma. The bread that falls into it now becomes a sheni latuma, and therefore limit al kikar sheni sha'osa shlishi b'chulin. Rabbi Akiva has a unique shita that we don't paskin like, that none of our previous mishnayos paskin like, and he holds that a second level, a sheni latuma, can render a shlishi latuma even with chulin, even with non-holy food, even with non-truma and non-kachim. Now, if you recall, we had learned not that way, that the highest, or the lowest level of tumah that you can get with chulin is a sheni l'tumah. Rabbi Akiva disagrees, and he says, based on this pasuk, you can even achieve a shlishi l'tumah with chulin. You need to hold that in your head for the rest of today's daf.
But a Ravi is for
Kodesh. A Ravi is for Kachim, but Rabbi Akiva says that you can have a Shlishi in Chulin, you can have a Shlishi for Truma, and you can have a Revi'i for Kachim. Everyone agrees Shlishi for Truma and Revi'i for Kachim. Rabbi Akiva adds even a Shlishi for Chulin. We do not paskin this way. This is a unique Shita that is disagreed upon by all the other Tanoim. However, we're saying that Rabbi Yossi subscribes to this. V'hacha heichi darish, and based upon Rabbi Akiva's usage of the word Yitma, which means not only does it become Tameh, but it has the power to make other things Tameh, he uses the very same Yitma principle for another pasuk. It says in a later pasuk, it says v'chol mashkeh asher yishaseh b'chol kali yitma. That the Torah says, now I should tell you the entire text of the pasuk because we're going to need this whole pasuk today. The whole pasuk, someone please open up Benny's Gemara. The pasuk says two things. The pasuk says mikol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel, from all food that is going to be eaten, asher yavo alav mehem yitma, that if a source of tumah, asher yavo alav mayim yitma, if a source of tumah falls onto that food after the food has come in contact with water, then that food item shall become tameh. And then it says v'chol mashkeh asher yishaseh b'chol kali, that any liquid that is drunk from a vessel, that shall also become tameh. That shall also become tameh. Now, what we're going to do is the word yitma is written in the context of liquids, of fluids in this pasuk, and what we're going to see is that because the word that is used is yitma and not tameh, just like Rabbi Akiva had taught that the word yitma means it has the power to make other things tameh, Rabbi Yossi says the word yitma in this pasuk in reference to fluids is telling me the exact same thing. That what? Yitma l'tameh tumas ochlin. This teaches me that fluids, once they become tameh, have the power to be metameh foods. Ata omer l'tameh tumas ochlin, o eno elo l'tameh tumas mashkin. So you might say no. You might say that not only that maybe fluid only achieves the ability to be metameh liquids. Maybe it doesn't have the ability to be metameh ochlin. So amart lo kach haya. So you have to respond to that and say, no, it's not that way, or it hasn't been that way. Now, that's the end of the Brisa, and the Gemara now is going to insert an interlude here and saying, what do you mean, what is that? It's not that way. It's not that way is not an answer, right? We're suggesting that when the Torah says that fluids have the ability to be metame, maybe they have the ability to be metame other fluids, but they don't have the ability to be metame food. And the Brisa says, no, it ain't so. Now, what does that mean, it ain't so? My lo kachoya. Amar Rav Papa lo matzinu tuma sha'ose kayotse ba. Rav Papa says that we never find, that we're going to bring a pasuk for that principle later on, we never find that a source of tuma has the ability to be metame its own kind. In other words, we never find that food can be metame food, or liquid can be metame liquid, or a kli can be metame a kli. All we find, right, and based upon that principle that food is not metame other food, at least not when it comes to chulin, let's keep that in mind. We're not talking about trum and kachim.
We hold that way.
What?
We hold that way.
Well, yes, because right, in general, we hold that way. We never find that one food can be metame another food, at least not with chulin. And based upon that principle, we say similarly that one liquid cannot be metame another liquid. Ravina Amar Migufe Dekra Nami Lo Matzis Amart. Ravina says that the pasuk itself is indicative of that fact. You don't need to draw from some external source to derive that, which you'll see the external source shortly. But Ravina says you can derive it from the pasuk itself that we're drawing from. And what is that? It says Yitma Latame Tumas Mashkin. That you have to say that when the Torah talks about liquids having the ability to be metame, it must mean that they have to be metame food. Why? The Ital kadaitach yitma deseifa letame tumas mashkin yitma lo masas amart yitma letame tumas mashkin. The Ital kadaitach yitma deseifa letame tumas mashkin yitma duration ami letame tumas mashkin ni arvinhu v'nichtavinhu mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel asher yavo olav mayim v'chol mashker asher yirsa b'chol kali yitma. So the Gemara says as follows. If you look at the totality of the pasuk, you see that the pasuk is talking about two different subjects. One subject is tumas ochlin, food that becomes tamei and has the ability to make other things tamei. The second subject, the second half of the pasuk, is talking about liquid that becomes tamei and has the ability to be metamei other things. Now, if both the first part of the pasuk and the second part of the pasuk we're talking about substances which are tamei and have the ability to be metamei liquids, because the first part of the pasuk is telling me that food has the ability to be metame liquids, and if the second part of the pasuk was talking about liquids that has the ability to be metame liquids, then it would not be necessary for the Torah to write the word yitma twice, because really yitma is coming to teach me that this object has the ability to be metame other things. And if the other thing that they're both being metame is the same, that they're both being metame liquids, then the Torah should have just written yitma once at the end of the pasuk. And that's the way normally you and I would speak. If I'm saying that I'm going to the store, right, and I wanted to tell you like this: I'm going to buy eggs when I go to the store, and I'm going to buy milk when I go to the store. Well, that's not normally the way you speak. You would say, I'm going to buy eggs and I'm going to buy milk when I go to the store. The only reason that I would say when I go to the store twice is because I'm going to two different stores. In the similar vein, when the Torah says yitma twice, it's coming to teach me that there's two different operatives here. The yitma that is working with ochlin is different from the yitma that's working for mashkin. Therefore, trei yitma lamali, ela yitma dereisha latami tumas mashkin, and yitma deseif latami tumas ochlin. Therefore, what it means is that when the first part of the pasuk says that food has the ability to be metame, it's saying that food has the ability to be metame liquids. And when the second time, when the Torah talking about liquids, is saying that liquids has the ability not to be metame liquids, but rather to be metame food. Ve'ema latame es hakelim. So the Gemara's then question is, well, now that we've established that liquid can be metame food, let's also argue from that pasuk that liquid has the ability to be metame kelim as well. And remember, Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that liquid can only be metame food, but not be metame kelim. But let's use this very same pasuk to tell me that liquid has the power to be metame kelim as well. And then the Gemara says, "V'lav kal v'chomeru." So but the answer is you can make a kal v'chomer. He says, "Uma kli shemetame mashka ein metame kli." He says, look, a utensil has the ability to be metame liquids, and yet a kli cannot be metame another kli. So mashkin haboin machmas kli. So if a liquid became tame through touching a tame kli, which is the context of the pasuk in the Torah that we've just cited, so ein odin shelo yatamu es hakelim. So then surely it should not, if a liquid became tame through a kli, and a kli itself does not have the ability to be metame another kli, then surely the liquid that became tame because of a kli cannot be metame another kli. That's the kal v'chomer. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ema kilo mitame umashkin haboin machmas kli, aval mashkin haboin machmas sheretz hachanami demitame." So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Maybe it's true that liquid that became tame through a kli does not have the ability to be metame a kli. But maybe liquid that became tame through coming in contact with a sheretz directly, maybe that does have the power to be metame a kli. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute. Mashkin haboin machmas sheretz miksivi. The pasuk is not talking about liquid that became tame through direct contact with the sheretz. The pasuk is only talking about liquid that became tame through coming in contact with a kli. And since that's the source text of where I know that liquid could be metame, it must be talking about being metame ochlin. V'lav mikal v'chomer ka'asi. And therefore we go back to our kal v'chomer. Uma mashkin haboin machmas kli mitamin mitamin. That if you have liquid that, so the Gemara says, use the kal v'chomer in the other direction then. If you're going to say that the pasuk is telling me that liquid that is tame through a kli has the ability to be metame food, why don't you make a kal v'chomer to address liquid that became tame through a sheretz? Uma mashkin haboin machmas kli metamein. If liquid has the ability to be metame, if it only itself became tame through a kli, then surely mashkin haboin machmas sheretz lo kol shekain. Then certainly liquid that became tame through contact with a sheretz should also have the ability to be metame. And our question is, once it has the ability to be metame, it should be metame everything, not only food but also kelim. So therefore, our question is, make a kal v'chomer from our pasuk. I will grant you that our pasuk, which talks about liquid that became tamei through a kli, can only be metamei ochlin. But use that pasuk as a source to teach me that liquid that became tamei through a sheretz has the ability not only to be metamei food, but also to be metamei kelim. The Gemara answers, Dayo lavo min adin lios kenidon. The answer is because we apply the principle of Dayo. Dayo, which is not a Belafonte song, but rather Dayo. Dayo is a principle that states as follows: Dayo lavo min hadin lihios kenidon. That it means as follows: that it means that when I'm making a logical derivation from a source text in the Torah, even though the logic may dictate that I can extract an even stronger argument from the pasuk, but Dayo teaches me that I can only pull out from the pasuk what the pasuk teaches. If the pasuk teaches that the source of tumah can only be metame ochlin but cannot be metame kelim, then anything that I'm extracting logically from that pasuk also only has the power to be metame ochlin and not to be metame kelim. So therefore, even though you should be able to make a logical argument that liquid that became tummy through a sheretz has greater tumah powers than liquid that became tummy through a kli, but since the whole source that liquid is metame in the first place comes from this pasuk of liquid that became tummy through a kli, and there it only has the ability to be metame food, then so too liquid that becomes tummy through a sheretz only has the ability to be metame food and not to be metame kelim. Yes?
This whole argument is introducing a concept that I don't recall, that there's, we say there's different levels of tumah, and now within those levels of tumah there's a concept that there could be a stronger type of tumah, like if you're a sheni.
Sure.
So do we have a
same thing?
In other words, you have a tumah sheni of something, and now there's different levels of strengths of ability to transmit within that. I mean, that's what they're saying.
Correct, absolutely. But this was what we saw from Reb Shimon and Reb Yossi 2 days ago. We saw that from them that they hold that liquid can only be metame ochlin, but it cannot be metame kelim. So you see that there's a bifurcation within the level of tumah itself, that it only can be metame one kind of thing, but not another kind of thing. And also you have to look at how it became tamei in the first place. Sure, absolutely. So now the Gemara says, so yitma deresha hechi daresh. So now let's go back and analyze how you were understanding the first part of the pasuk. Remember, the first part of the pasuk is talking about food that becomes tamei. The Torah tells me yitma to teach me that it has the ability to be metame mashkin. That's how we were understanding the first part of the pasuk. We said mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel asher yavo alav mayim yitma. That any food that has water that primes it for tumah, it shall become tamei, and it has the ability to do what? Yitma letame asamashkin. It has the ability now to make liquids tamei. So the Gemara says, where did you get that premise that we're talking about liquid? Ata omer letame asamashkin o eno elo letame asakli. Maybe what the pasuk in the first case is saying is that food has the ability to be metame a kli, not just to be metame liquids. So amart kal v'chomer. So the Gemara says, no, make a kal v'chomer. Uma mashke shemetame oichel eno metame kli. He says liquids have the ability to make food tame, and yet liquids that become tame through a kli do not have the ability to be metame a kli. Ochel she'ein metame ochel. So a food item which cannot be metame another food item, as we mentioned before, that one thing cannot be metame its same kind. So then eino din shelo yitame kli. So then surely a food item which cannot make food tame also cannot make a kli tame. So the Gemara says, Ha'ama ani mekayim yitma letame es hamashkin. So therefore, what does the word yitma teach me? It's not coming to tell me that food can be metame food, and it's not coming to tell me that food can be metame a kli. The only option left is that food can be metame liquid. So shehein alulin lekabel tuma. And the last part that the Brisa says is that after all, liquid is more susceptible to tuma than anything else. So the Gemara now has to analyze that phrase in the Brisa, which when it says, why did you need to add that in? My irya mashkin mishum dalulin lekabel tuma tepukli mishum deleki midi acharina. The Gemara says, why did you have to shtup that last phrase in? that the reason why the pasuk is referring to food being metame liquid is because liquid is more susceptible than other things to be makabel tuma. Even without that argument, you've just demonstrated that when the Torah says that food can be matame other things, if it's not talking about food and it's not talking about kalim, what else is there for it to be matame? So, ergo, you don't even need that argument that liquid is more susceptible to tumah. Just by virtue of the process of elimination, you know that the pasuk's talking about liquid. So the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar. What the Gemara is trying to convey is as follows: B'chi tema ochel chamor demetame mashkin. Maybe you'll argue that food is a stronger source of tumah in and of itself. Innately, it's a stronger source of tumah. And the reason is because we see that it has the ability to make fluids tameh, and therefore nitmaye l'kli. And therefore, if food has the ability to make mashkin tameh, it should also have the ability to make kalim tameh as well. So no, hahu chumra demashkin hu mishum demashkin alulun lekabel tameh. The Gemara says you cannot extrapolate one from the other. Just because food has the ability to make liquid tameh does not mean it has the ability to make kalim tameh as well. Because umahi alilasan shemekablan tuma shelo behechsher. Now, what makes liquid, and what's the reason? Because liquid is more susceptible to tuma. And how do you know that liquid is more susceptible or more sensitive to tuma? The answer is because liquid is when it comes to food items, liquid is that which does not require priming. When it comes to food, the only way that food can become tummy is if liquid first falls on it, and then tumah touches it. But if, let's say, you have an apple that never came in contact with water, then it would not become tummy when a sheretz touches it. Liquid is different, however. Liquid, if a sheretz touches liquid, or if a kli that's tummy touches liquid, it doesn't need to be primed in order to be makabel tumah.
Didn't say that.
This indicates that liquid is more susceptible to tumah than food is. And that's the reason why ochel can be metame liquid. Don't extrapolate from the fact that ochel can be metame liquid that ochel could also be metame kalim. That's the point of the brisa.
Didn't you say that mashkin is zoichel earlier, a couple of days before?
I don't remember in what context that was said, but the point is that here we're making a clear distinction between ochelin and mashkin.
I know, but I thought we said earlier that
it depends. It depends on the context of the discussion. You'd have to show me the Gemara,
No,
but it wouldn't be a
last week.
stira though. It wouldn't be a stira because the point is that in different contexts of hilchos tumah, sometimes you might group ochelin and mashkin together. But for our purposes now, there's clearly a distinction between ochelin and mashkin. Now yitma. De'ein osa kayotse ba. So now the Gemara says, look, it seems like from Ravina, the way that Ravina was learning the pasuk, the word yitma teaches me two things. Number one, yitma teaches me that not only is the object in question tameh, but that it has the ability to make other things tameh. But the other thing that yitma teaches me is that it can only be metame something that is dissimilar to itself, but it cannot be metame its own kind. The way that Rashi explains it is, if the Torah would have said yitameh, which literally means it shall make other things tameh, then the Torah would have been conveying to me that this object, whether it's food or liquid, can be metame anything, whether it's something that's not its kind or something that is its kind. If the Torah would have said just the word tameh, then it would have implied that it is tameh, but it cannot be metame anything else. But now that it's written sort of the middle word, which is yud tes mem aleph, but with the nikudot of yitma, it's coming to teach me both a riboy and a miut. It's telling me, number one, it can be metame other things, but it's limited in its ability to be metame other things, and that it can only be metame things that are dissimilar to it, but it cannot be metame its own kind. And the Gemara is questioning that because according to you, Ravina, that all of this teaching is self-contained within this pasuk from Yitma. That's not true. Mehacha nafka, mehasam nafka, because we actually learn that principle. That's a source of tumah cannot be metame its own kind. Food cannot be metame food, and liquid cannot be metame liquid. We learn from a whole different other pasuk. We learn it out from B'chiyu tanmayim al zera, v'nafal menivlasam alav tamehu. The Torah says that when water falls on a seed to prime it for tumah, and then nevela, which is a source of tumah, falls on top of it, it is tameh. So the word hu is a miut. It is tameh, hu tameh, ve'ein osa tumah kayotze ba. That it can make it itself becomes tameh, but it cannot be metame its own kind. A seed cannot make another seed tameh, and by inference, a liquid cannot make its own kind, another liquid tameh. So the Gemara says, we have a question. According to you, Ravina, why is that pasuk necessary at all if the word yitma already teaches me that principle? The Gemara's answer is, Chad b'mashkin haboin machmas sheretz, v'chad b'mashkin haboin machmas kli. You need two psukim because there are two types of tamei liquids. One is a tamei liquid that became tamei through a kli, and there's one pasuk to tell me that it doesn't have enough tumah power to be metame its own kind. And there's another kind of liquid that becomes tamei through the sheretz itself, and you need another pasuk to tell me that it too does not have enough power to be metame its own kind. Utzrichi, and the reason why you need both is Di'i ashmeinon b'mashkin haboin machmas kli mishum delo chamiri. Aval b'mashkin haboin machmas sheretz de chamiri ema osa tuma kayotze ba. If I only had a pasuk that was talking about liquid that became tamei through a kli, and there the pasuk says yitma to tell me that it doesn't have the ability to be metame other liquids, I would have thought that's only because it is a weaker form of tumah because it became tamei through a kli. But when it becomes tamei through a sheretz itself, when it's a stronger form of tumah, maybe it does have the ability to make other liquids tamei, and therefore that's why the Torah had to write v'chol zera v'chiyutan mayim al zera. That's why you need the other pasuk. So the Gemara asks a question: V'lishmeinon mashkin haboin machmas sheretz, v'kol shekein mashkin haboin machmas kli. Well, then just write the other pasuk of v'chiyutan mayim al zera, which is talking about where the source of tumah itself comes in contact with the seed or the liquid, and tell me that it doesn't have the ability to be betami its own kind, and then I don't need the pasuk of yitma. Because once I know that even a liquid that becomes tummy through a sheretz does not have the ability to be matami its own kind, then surely a liquid that becomes tummy through a kli does not have the ability to be matami its own kind. The Gemara answers, you're right, but milsa da'asya b'kal v'chomer tarach v'kosav l'kra. The Gemara says, you're right. It really wasn't necessary to write it in a second pasuk, but sometimes we do find that even though there are halachas that we could derive logically from one pasuk to another, sometimes the Torah writes a second pasuk explicitly to teach it to you anyway. This is a fallback position that we don't normally see in the Gemara, unless the Gemara gets really stuck.
It's a cop-out.
I didn't want to say it's a cop-out, but it's basically the Gemara says, and again, a very precise analysis would have to be done to determine all those cases where the Gemara does answer it using this way. But it is a situation where the Gemara says, when we have no other choice, we have to fall back to this position that sometimes, even though you don't need a pasuk because you would learn it out logically, sometimes the Torah states that which could also be derived through a logical argument.
You think you learn something extra from it, though, right?
It could be. I'm sure there's something else that we'd have to.
At the left, a whole lot is quoted by Beth. Torah v'kosav l'kra and Masoras Hashatz.
The Masoras Hashatz gives you all the different cases. Okay, so it'd be an interesting scholarly analysis to determine all of those places. Amalei Ravina l'Ravashi. So Ravina now says to Ravashi, V'ha Amar Rava lo Rabbi Yossi savar k'Rabbi Akiva v'lo Rabbi Akiva savar k'Rabbi Yossi. Now, the question that we're asking is based upon what we started with today, which is that in trying to analyze from where Rabbi Yossi knows that liquid can be metame food, but it cannot be metame kalim, what did we say? Rabbi Yossi subscribes to his Rabbi Akiva, who uses the word yitma. But Rava had made an explicit statement that contradicts that. Rava had said that Rabbi Yossi does not hold like his teacher Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva does not hold like his student Rabbi Yossi. So how can the two statements coexist? The Gemara answers, Amar le Rabbi Yossi b'shitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbo Amra v'le lo svirale. Answers the Gemara that Rabbi Yossi subscribes to Rabbi Akiva's hermeneutic derivation, but does not hold of his psak halacha. In other words, Rabbi Akiva's psak halacha is that you can have a shlishi l'tumah with chulin. That Rabbi Yossi does not agree with, but he does agree that when you see the word yitma in the Torah, it teaches you that not only does the object itself become tamei, but it has the ability to be matame other things. And it's based on his ability to see that in the word yitma that he applies it to liquids which are referenced in the pasuk that Rabbi Yossi uses. So Amalei Rav Ashi la Rav Kahana Bishlam Rabbi Yossi lo Savar la Rabbi Akiva. I see very clearly how Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold like Rabbi Akiva, and we're going to demonstrate that in just a moment, where we see that Rabbi Yossi holds that you don't have such a thing as a shlishi l'tumah for chulin. Where do you see that? The Tanya Amar Rabbi Yossi Minayin l'Revi'i bakodesh shehu pasel. The question that Rabbi Yossi was asking is, how do you know that there's such a concept of a Revi'i l'tumah when it comes to kachim? The Torah doesn't state it explicitly, so we're going to derive it from a logical argument. And the logical argument is going to go like this. Vidinhu. It's a logical argument as follows. Uma mechusar kippurim shemuter bitruma pasul b'kodesh. There's a status that a person can have called a mechusar kippurim. Now what is a mechusar kippurim? It's a person who was tameh. Let's say he was a mitzorah. He needs to be mitaher from his tumah, plus he has to bring a korban. So let's say he's gone to the mikveh already. He's experienced Herav Shemesh, which means the sun set after he went to mikveh, but he's still not completely tahor until he brings his korban and gets a final atonement. During that status, between the time that he went to the mikveh and the sun set, to the time that he brings his korban, he's called a mechusar kippurim. During that period of time, he's allowed to eat truma, and truma is subject to a shlishi l'tumah, and yet this fellow is still allowed to eat it, but he's not allowed to eat kachim. So what do you see from there? You see from that principle alone that kachim has a greater sensitivity or susceptibility to tumah than even something like truma, which is subject to a shlishi l'tumah. So it's on that basis, shlishi shapasul b'truma eno din sheyasa revi'i b'kodesh. And therefore that teaches me that when you have something which is a shlishi, it can convey tumah to kachim and make it into a revi. That's the argument, and I hope I'm expressing it in the way that Chazal meant it. I'm not sure if I am, but this is the way I'm able to understand it.
It's us, it's not you.
No. I'm just saying. I hope I understand the Gemara correctly. The fact of the matter is that a mechusar kippurim is allowed to eat truma, which has a certain level of sensitivity to tumah, and yet it's not as sensitive as kachim because the mechusar kippurim is not allowed to eat kachim. So you see that kachim, if truma is susceptible to a shlishi l'tumah, kachim has to be susceptible to an even more delicate kind of tumah, which we would call a revi'i l'tumah. That's the principle that Rabbi Yossi is bringing from here. So, v'lomadin li shlishi b'kodesh min haTorah. Now, how do we know that you can have something called a shlishi l'tumah when it comes to truma? That's based on a pasuk which we'll get to a little bit later. U'revi'i mekal v'chomer. And we learn that a kachim can become a revi from a kal v'chomer. Now, shlishi min haTorah, how do you know that truma can become a shlishi? It's based upon the following pasuk. The Torah says generically that if meat touches any food which is tamei, it may not be eaten. And Rabbi Yossi makes the following argument from that pasuk. It says, "Milo askinan denoga b'sheni." So the pasuk, when it says that something is tamei, and if it touches a piece of meat, that meat becomes tamei. So when it says that something, that source is tamei, it doesn't tell you how tamei it is. And since we already know the principle that you can have a sheni l'tumah from the Torah, so maybe that thing that is tamei is a sheni l'tumah. The fact that it's able to render the piece of meat tamei must mean that there's a concept of shlishi l'tumah. So therefore you automatically know that certain kinds of holy foods are susceptible to a shlishi l'tumah from the pasuk itself. How do you know a revi? Revi mikal v'chomer kid amrinan. Just like we said, that if truma, which is not susceptible to a mechusar kippurim, which is not which can be eaten by mechusar kippurim, right? But kachim is more sensitive than that. So then it's kal v'chomer. The argument is that kachim has to be of a higher level of susceptibility, and therefore we have this class called a revi'i l'tumah. So now the Gemara says like this: V'isal kadaitach savar karebi Akiva nisni nami revi'i betruma v'chamishi b'kodesh. And the argument is as follows: if the whole basis for Rabbi Yossi knowing that there's such a thing called a shlishi l'tuma is based on this pasuk that we just cited, and the pasuk we said could be talking about even a sheni l'tuma because a sheni l'tuma exists by chulin, and therefore you see that a sheni can render something into a shlishi. Well, according to Rabbi Akiva, not only do you have a sheni l'tuma from in chulin, you also have something called a shlishi l'tuma for chulin. So maybe the pasuk that Rabbi Yossi just quoted is talking about a piece of food that is a shlishi l'tuma. And therefore it's coming to tell you in the Torah that you can have a revi'i l'tuma, and use the kal v'chomer for kachim to tell you that you can have a chamishi l'tuma. The fact that Rabbi Yossi does not make that argument clearly demonstrates that he does not subscribe to Rabbi Akiva's halacha that you can have a shlishi l'tuma in chulin. That's the argument that the Gemara is making. So you see clearly that Rabbi Yossi does not subscribe to Rabbi Akiva. But the other way, Ela Rabbi Akiva lo savar ka Rabbi Yossi minola. But where do you see that Rabbi Akiva does not subscribe to Rabbi Yossi? Remember, Rabbi Yossi uses a logical argument to say that even though there's a pasuk that tells you about shlishi, you use a logical argument to tell you that you can have a revi. How do you know that Rabbi Akiva doesn't subscribe to that? The Gemara says, Amar lei delo lishtameit tana v'lisnei revi b'truma v'chamisha b'kodesh v'nema Rabbi Akiva hi. So the Gemara says the very fact that there is no brisa anywhere that we can find that suggests that you can even have a chamishi l'tuma for kachim. There's no one that holds that way. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva's understanding that you can have a shlishi of chulin, if you would subscribe to Rabbi Yossi's logical argument, then there should be such a thing as a chamishi l'tuma when it comes to kachim. The fact that there is no brisa that says that is indicative of the fact that Rabbi Akiva himself must not have held of Rabbi Yossi's logical argument. Because if he did hold of a logical argument, we should have found a brisa that was stated by Rabbi Akiva stating that truma is subject to a revi l'tuma and kachim is subject to a chamishi l'tuma. But since no one says that, it must mean that Rabbi Akiva doesn't hold of Rabbi Yossi's logical argument, and therefore even Rabbi Akiva, who holds that you can have a shlishi l'tuma for chulin, must hold that truma is limited to also a shlishi, and kachim is limited to a revi. And this is where we'll hold it for today. You have a wonderful day.